Great.
Our
I'll just
speaker, our speaker is Dave Reitsema. Dave, welcome today, and the mic is yours.
welcome. Today we're going to be talking about transmission of ship mail from Guatemala. This presentation is being made by the International Society of Guatemala Collectors, which is the organization that is known for its involvement with Guatemalan philately. And briefly, we're going to talk today about transmitting printed communications. 200 years ago, when someone wanted to send a letter, they had limited options, and typically it was done privately through agents who hand delivered it, or increasingly through the government postal system. Was called a service because in many cases they operated at a financial loss and gradually became more and more of a monopoly to ensure some kind of economic stability. But the general principle is that when a letter is going to be sent, someone pays. In the pre-stamp era, before postage stamps were printed and used, typically a letter was sent without prepayment, and that created a lot of interesting problems in the transmission of mail, and ultimately the recipient paid. Over time, that began to evolve into prepayment or franco the mail, and as a result of that evolving prepayment, post offices gradually developed regulations and rules. The reason for that is because once it was delivered to the post office, the government was responsible. We're going to talk today, too, about routing international mail from Guatemala, and that involved the development of dispatch offices where all mail leaving and entering the country came through, and then the evolving routing instructions that senders used, which is similar to what we still see today in on covers that say, for example, via airmail or first class. And we'll end today briefly with a discussion of packet mail and other miscellaneous collecting areas that we all are aware of and enjoy. So this is a map of Guatemala, and the red arrows point towards dispatch offices that became the point of entry and exit for all international mail in Guatemala. Before, during before in the colonial period, most of the mail came from central Mexico down through Guatemala, Guatemala City, and then on into Central America. And you'll see here the East Coast ports of Livingston and Puerto Barrios, and on the West Coast, Champerico and Port of San Jose. So we'll start by looking at mail on the East Coast, and this folded letter was handed directly to a purser on the steamship. It was written in Izabal, which is some ways inland. Then it went to Livingston, where you'll see it went directly up to Belize. The black hand stamp on the upper left says Belize. From there, it went to London, and you'll see on the lower center the London hand stamp, which is Colonies Day Article 13, which regulated the rate. In this case, it was rated 18. It then went across the channel to Paris and ultimately to the recipient. So it's sort of fun, if you like interesting things, to look at this and understand that postal history has a lot of interesting challenges. In any event, this is an early cover that went to France via steamship. Here's a folded letter that was sent via, that was prepaid, and it went via the West Coast. And one reason that it would do that is, first of all, Guatemala City was closer to the West Coast, and travel to the East Coast was difficult and slow. So this folded letter was prepaid. It's prepaid 4 reals. It was equivalent of 50 cents US at the time, which is, as you may imagine, expensive. Canceled March in Guatemala City. This cover would have been placed on a steamship and sent down to Panama, where it crossed over to the east coast of Panama and then traveled to New York City. That was 1860. Here's another one, 1860, but this time it is not franked. And so the question that we think about when we say nobody works for free and somebody pays, how did it get to New York? So in Guatemala, the letter itself was written in Esquintla. It went from there to Guatemala City. It may have gone directly to the via an agent to a steamship on the West Coast. And Guatemala had contracts with steamships to carry the mail on the West Coast down to Panama, where Panama would transport Guatemala's mail across to the East Coast. That in 1862, Guatemala and the United States signed a postal treaty with a uniform rate of 10 cents US. That was about 1 month before this cover was mailed. And in New York City, so now New York City is where this is going to be paid, it was assessed 10 cents per the treaty, an additional 10 cents postage due. Here's another cover with more markings on it from Guatemala to New York. This time you'll see in the middle of the folded letter, the hand stamp Franco, which indicated that the postage had been paid in Guatemala City. And then the markings, of course, show that it was arrived in New York. So it had the New York Steamship 10, which was assessed in New York City. So one of the curious things about Guatemalan postal history is that Guatemala did not join the UPU until 1881. The UPU was formed in 1874 to try and deal with making rates uniform and ensuring delivery of foreign mail that came into a country's postal system. This is an example of a rare hand stamp on Guatemalan postage, because of the UPU and that contract, you would think that it would not still be a problem to cross the Panama Canal. But Panama cleverly did not join the UPU until 1904. My guess is it didn't want to transmit all the West Coast mail of Central and South America for free. And so they maintained their independence for many more years. I put these two postcards in because in looking at these, it will explain why all mail began being routed through the East Coast rather than the West Coast. The upper left card shows passengers arriving in Port of San Jose by steamship. And you can see how they hoisted those people up off of a longboat to get them onto the wharf. And then below is the actual wharf that was set up to be able to handle incoming commerce. You can see railroad tracks going out there. Port of San Jose and Champerico are not natural harbors, and so it was always a problem. These cards were in 1900, dated 1900. Prior to that wharf being built, ships would unload onto longboats like that picture in the upper left, and then rowed in to the beach itself to be unloaded. So because of that, mail began being regularly routed through Livingston on the East Coast. So here you'll see below the registry box the instruction via Livingston. And that became common. It saved a lot of time as far as having to take a steamship down to Panama, cross Panama, steamship back up north. So in the late 1880s, Livingston gradually supplanted Port of San Jose as the major dispatch office. So even though Livingston increased in importance, there were still times when people would route mail via the West Coast rather than the East Coast. And that was done during epidemic quarantines in the Caribbean and Atlantic ports where the ships weren't allowed to land. So this cover was the insert letter dated 1886 was sent from Guatemala City to the Pacific north of San Francisco, and then by train across the United States to New York. One of the problems with routing mail to Livingston, there was a number of problems, but a major problem if you were mailing something was that although it would get to Livingston, there was no assurance that the ship that it was placed on would actually go in any direction that you wanted. For example, it could be a ship that was going to Cuba. It could be a ship that was going to the Bahamas. And so mailers realized that, and they wanted to make sure that the ship the mail was placed on was going in the general direction. And in this case, you'll see the indication of via Livingston and New Orleans, because that was the fastest route for them to get to their destination, in this case, Germany. So it would have gone to New Orleans, put on a train to New York City, then on a steamship to Germany. Again, the same issue is shown with this, where the routing instructions said via Livingston and New York. So here are the senders hoping that the ship that it's placed on in Livingston will go to New York. One of the problems that mailers had was if the cover got to Livingston and went into an international mail bag, there was no assurance that it would go through New York to Germany in this case. It might very well and often did go in a mail bag from Livingston to Paris, but it could go to other ports down in south part of Europe. So here the sender is instructing that it be placed on a ship that went from Livingston to New York on its way to Germany. Livingston was not a very developed port. It was sort of more like a swamp, and in order to get mail there, it would have to be placed on a small ship taken to Livingston, where steamships would touch port, and so that became an issue for Guatemala. And President Rufino Barrios wanted to link the capital with the eastern coast, but he wanted it to be a meaningful port. And his nephew worked towards the founding and development of Puerto Barrios. The result was that the mail did not have to be loaded onto some transferred by ship to Livingston, which saved time and money. And Puerto Barrios rapidly became the major East Coast port in Guatemala. This routing instructions were simplified by the use, in this case, of a sticker. And we've all seen those. Those are real popular covers on eBay, usually sell for a lot of money. They were not official, and they were probably sold at what we would think of as an office supply store or something. They weren't sold or used at the post office, but mailers could. So here we see the routing instructions via Puerto Barrios, New Orleans. And that was probably the fastest way to get this letter to Germany, because otherwise it would be on a ship all the way around to New York, which was much longer than putting it on a train in New Orleans to New York City. So coming the opposite direction was the same issue for mailers. And this is just one example, but this is a commercial mailer in San Francisco who initially routed it via a steamer, San Blas, and obviously missed that steamer. So they put a second one on via San Jose to Guatemala and missed that steamer. So they, the third time, put steamer City of Para. And so apparently it made that steamer. And then they further instructed that it be sent via Champerico. So you'll remember that was one of the two major dispatch offices on the west coast of Guatemala. Champerico was quite a ways north of Puerto San Jose, and it was preferable if you were mailing to an address in northwest Guatemala. In this case, Exel Heights was on a train line. It was mainly, in a sense, a privately operated post office for a finca outside of Cotopeque, which was about 30 miles from Champerico. So that's a fun kind of cover showing mail coming into the country. These are what are referred to as unofficial ship overprints. And there's 25 different ones, and you'll see the 5 different major types. They all are different fonts, and so they're distinguishable that way. They are not official. They're Cinderellas, and they were attributed to Federico Sorek, who you are probably familiar with, a famous Guatemalan forger, and none of these exist on cover. If you ever see one on cover, it's someone's fabrication. but they're a lot of fun, and they're not cheap anymore. They used to be cheap, but they're not anymore. They're expensive on eBay. So there are, in addition to routing instructions, other markings that you'll see occasionally on covers. This Reitsema Hora indicated that the mail had been received at the last moment, the ultimate hour, and was not included in the dispatch. That was really important to the sender because the mail, in this case, had to catch, first of all, a courier to get to what was probably a rail line at that time, and the railroad took it to Lake Isabel, where it had to catch one of two weekly ferries across Lake Isabel to get down to either Puerto Barrios or Livingston. So you'll see that it missed the Panzos shipment. It went to Livingston a week later, and then it took another several weeks to get to London. But that's one marking. Cecile Gruson also wrote several articles and was intrigued by postal cards that were uprated for no obvious reason. This postal card was issued in 1890. This cover was used 4 years later, and the 3 cents paid the rate to Germany. So the question she posited was, why was it uprated an additional 2 cents? And she speculated that it was because for 2 cents, the post office would reopen the mail bag after hours and include the cover, the postal card, in the mail bag to try and meet the sailing of a ship. And you probably are familiar with the term servicio nocturno, which was the same type of service that required payment of an additional fee. Now this is cover with a Pacific Mail steamship purser's hand stamp. Pacific Mail steamships were the primary steamship line operating on the West Coast in the Pacific, all the way from the United States down into Latin America. So when someone wrote a letter on board ship, if they prepaid the postage, they could hand that to the ship's purser, who then was responsible for it. In this case, the purser had a special hand stamp for that purpose. So that's what's on this cover. And then gradually, over years, they devised a marking called packet bot, which is shown here. And so when this postcard was mailed on board a ship, the purser would mark it as packet bot. And then you'll see a very common hand stamp at the bottom, which is San Francisco paid all. So the San Francisco post office would make sure that the mail in the incoming mail bag from the steamship was properly prepaid. And then we'll conclude with this. There's a lot of ephemera that are fun to collect. You'll see occasionally, and you'll come across those, whether they're baggage tags, boarding passes, ship manifests. And I just included this one because it's fun. It's a a souvenir from the city of Para, which is one of Pacific mail steamships, passenger steamships, but it's a Christmas Eve menu that they printed up. You can't see in this, but it's all fancy gold lettering, and it's a trifold, so it would fold over into a mailable postcard, and I left it partly open here to show what that looked like. So with that, this presentation comes to an end. Thank you.